The morning Graham Prescott rode into the town of Redrock Flats with a warning burning a hole in his chest. The sky above the Arizona Territory was the color of a fresh bruise, and the woman he had come to save was already standing on her porch with a rifle across her knees like she had been expecting him for years. That was the spring of 1883, when the Santa Fe Railroad was pushing iron fingers across the desert and men like Harlan Cobb were using that progress as cover for greed so wide it blocked out the sun. Redrock Flats sat 30 miles east of Tucson, a town that had sprung up the way most towns did out here, from necessity and stubbornness, and a little bit of luck. It had a general store, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that never quite closed, and a handful of homesteads scattered around its edges like seeds tossed from a careless hand. Eva Yates owned one of those homesteads. She had come out to the Arizona Territory 5 years earlier with her husband, Daniel Yates, who had died of fever 2 winters past and left her with 40 acres, a small herd of cattle, a mule named Biscuit, and a stubbornness that Daniel had always said was her finest and most maddening quality. She was 28 years old, with dark hair she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, brown eyes that missed very little, and hands that were calloused from honest work. She was not the kind of woman who waited to be rescued, and the town of Redrock Flats had learned that lesson more than once. Graham Prescott was 31, a man who had spent the last 6 years working as a range detective for the Cattlemen's Association out of Denver, tracking rustlers and claim jumpers and the occasional land swindler. He was lean and sun-darkened, with green eyes that had seen enough trouble to be cautious and enough beauty to still notice it. He rode a big roan gelding named Scout and carried a Colt single-action Army on his hip and a rifle in his saddle scabbard, but his instinct had always been to talk first and reach for iron second. That instinct had kept him alive when faster men had not been so lucky. He had ridden through the night to get here, and the dust of that ride was still thick on his coat when he turned Scout onto the main road of Redrock Flats and kept going, past the saloon where 2 men were arguing on the steps, past the general store where a boy was sweeping the walk, all the way out to the Yates homestead on the eastern edge of the settlement, because that was where Harlan Cobb's plans began, and that was where they needed to be stopped. He saw her before he reached the gate. She was sitting in the chair she kept on the porch, which faced east toward the mountains that went pink and gold every morning, and she had her Winchester across her knees the way another woman might hold a piece of mending. Her hat was pushed back on her head, and she was watching him come up the road with an expression that was not surprise. Graham pulled Scout to a stop at the gate and pushed his own hat back. He looked at her for a moment, because there was something about the way she was sitting there that stopped him, something that made him feel like the ground under his horse's feet had shifted just slightly. He had not met Eva Yates before, but the association's man in Tucson had told him about her and described her as difficult, which Graham had found in his experience was usually what men said about women who would not be pushed around. "Mrs. Yates," he said, because he had learned her name from that same man in Tucson. "Mister," she said, without hostility but without warmth either, the way a woman speaks to a stranger who has ridden up to her gate at first light. "My name is Graham Prescott. I work for the Cattlemen's Association. I came out from Tucson to talk to you about Harlan Cobb." He watched her face carefully, the way he always watched faces when he was delivering news, looking for shock or fear or the particular blank look that sometimes meant a person already knew something terrible. What he saw instead was something that took him a moment to identify. It was resignation, the kind that sat not in the shoulders but behind the eyes. "Harlan Cobb," she said, and there was a flatness in her voice that said the name tasted the way old copper did. "What about him?" "He's filed a land claim against your property," Graham said. "A fraudulent one, Mrs. Yates. He's been doing it all across the eastern end of the territory, using a man named Royce Fulton who works out of the land office in Prescott to push false paperwork through. He's already taken 3 homesteads this spring. He means to take yours before the month is out." He stopped, waiting for the intake of breath, the wide eyes, the hand going to the mouth that he had seen on other people when they heard news like this. Eva Yates looked at him steadily. Then she said, "I already knew." Graham blinked. He had not expected that. "You knew," he said. "I have known for 2 weeks," she said. "Hiram Pollard at the general store heard something from a freighter who came through from Prescott City. I sent a letter to the land office myself to ask about my deed status and got back a letter full of polite words that said exactly nothing, which told me everything." She shifted the rifle on her knees and looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "So yes, Mr. Prescott, I already knew. The question now is what to do about it." Graham sat on Scout and looked at her and felt something move in his chest that was not entirely professional. There was something about her steadiness in the face of something that would have sent a lot of people running that caught him somewhere he had not expected. "All right," he said slowly. She tilted her head and looked at him the way you look at a man you are trying to measure. Then she said, "Are you staying to help me answer it?" He had not planned to stay. He had planned to deliver the warning and then ride to the next name on his list, a rancher named Beaumont about 15 miles north who was also in Cobb's sights. The association had not asked him to fight this battle on the ground. They had asked him to gather information and report. But there was something in the way she asked the question, not begging, not even hoping exactly. Just asking plainly, the way you ask someone if they want a cup of coffee, like the answer would be what it would be and she would deal with either one. "Yes, ma'am," Graham said, and found that he meant it in a way that went deeper than professional obligation. "I am." She looked at him for one more moment, then stood from her chair, the rifle easy in her hand. "Then tie your horse and come inside. I have coffee on and we have a great deal to figure out." He tied Scout to the post at her gate and followed her up the porch steps and into the house that smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something baking. And by the time he had sat down at her table, and she had set a cup in front of him, and he had gotten his first proper look at her face in the morning light coming through her window, Graham Prescott understood with the quiet certainty of a man who trusts his instincts that he was in significantly more trouble than Harlan Cobb had ever intended to cause him. The coffee was good. That much he noticed right away, strong and black the way he liked it, and it steadied him enough to set aside whatever was happening behind his ribs and focus on what she had spread on the table between them. Eva had documents, more than he had expected. There was her deed, a clean copy of it with the original still stored, she told him, with her brother-in-law in Tucson. There were 2 letters she had written and the useless replies she had received. There was a hand-drawn map of the eastern land parcels with notations in her small, precise handwriting, indicating which homesteads had already been lost and to whom. "You have been building a case," Graham said, looking at the map. "Someone had to," Eva said, sitting across from him with her own cup. "The men who lost their properties thought it was legal because the paperwork said it was. They did not know to look deeper. I knew to look deeper because Daniel, my husband, he was a surveyor before he became a rancher, and he taught me what proper land documentation looks like and what it looks like when someone has interfered with it." She tapped one of the letters. "This deed description is wrong by 140 feet on the eastern border. That is not a mistake anyone makes by accident." "No," Graham agreed, studying what she was pointing at. "No, it isn't. This is Royce Fulton's work. I've seen it before in 2 other counties." "Then you know what we need to counter it. Testimony from a qualified surveyor and a certified copy of the original territorial survey, plus evidence tying Fulton to Cobb directly." He looked up at her. "That last part is the hard piece." "I know." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Cobb is careful. He does not put his name on anything. He uses men like Fulton, and then he lets those men take the consequences when things go wrong. You know a good deal about Harlan Cobb." She met his eyes. "He came to see me 3 months ago, before Daniel had been gone a year. He came here and stood in my yard and told me this was fine land, and that a woman alone would find it difficult to hold, and that he would be willing to take it off my hands at a fair price. Her voice was even, but her jaw was set in a way that told him everything about how that visit had gone. I told him what he could do with his fair price. He smiled at me and tipped his hat and rode away, and 2 weeks later I heard about the Hendersons losing their place. The Hendersons were the first. Yes, and then the Morales family, and then old Pete Garrett, who had been on his land for 11 years. Her hands tightened on the cup. Pete was 62 years old. He packed everything he owned into a wagon and drove away from 11 years of his life, because a piece of paper with a corrupt man's seal on it told him he had to. That is not something I am willing to do. Graham looked at her across the table and felt the full weight of what she was facing, the particular grinding unfairness of power being used as a weapon against someone who had done everything right and still might lose because the system that was supposed to protect them had been bought. He had spent 6 years working within that system, sometimes helping it work the way it was supposed to, and sometimes watching it fail in ways that left a bad taste for weeks. "I have to ride out to see Jim Beaumont today," he said. "He's on Cobb's list too, but I will come back this afternoon if that's agreeable and we can lay out a plan." "It is agreeable," Eva said. She stood and refilled his cup without asking because she had noticed it was empty, and that small, unself-conscious gesture did something to him again. "Jim Beaumont is a good man. Tell him what is coming and tell him I said if he wants to combine what we know, he should come see me." "You know Jim Beaumont?" "Everyone knows Jim Beaumont. He's been in Redrock Flats since before there was a Redrock Flats." A small, dry smile crossed her face. "He once lent me a team of mules when Biscuit went lame during planting season and refused to let me pay for it. Any man who will do that is a good man in my accounting." Graham stood, picked up his hat. "I'll be back before sundown, Mrs. Yates." "Eva," she said, without looking up from the papers she was already straightening. "If you're going to help me fight for my land, you might as well use my given name." "Eva," he said, and the name felt different in his mouth than he had expected, comfortable in a way that was its own kind of warning. "Graham." She looked up then, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the table with the morning light between them and the sound of the territory waking up outside. And then Graham put his hat on and went back out to scout and rode north to find Jim Beaumont. Jim Beaumont was 70 years old and built like an oak tree that had survived a dozen hard winters, and he did not take the news about Harlan Cobb with the same composure Eva had. He took it with a stream of language that would have stripped paint, followed by a long silence, followed by the kind of cold, focused anger that Graham had learned was more useful than hot anger in difficult situations. "Eva Yates," Jim said when Graham delivered her message. "Smart woman. Daniel Yates was a lucky man and he knew it, God rest him." He squinted at Graham. "You staying to see this through, son?" "That's the plan," Graham said. Jim gave him a look that was measuring and then satisfied, the way an old man looks when a younger man says the right thing. "Good. Because we are going to need someone who knows how these land office schemes work from the inside. And these old hands of mine aren't much good for anything more delicate than a branding iron." He stood, set his own hat on his head. "Let's go see Eva." So Graham rode back to the Yates homestead that afternoon with Jim Beaumont and Jim's son, a quiet young man named Thomas who was 22 and had his father's solid quality. They sat around Eva's table, which was not really big enough for 4 people but managed it anyway, and they talked through what they knew and what they needed and how to get it. The plan that emerged from that afternoon was not simple, but it was workable. Graham would ride to Tucson to speak with the association's legal representative there, a man named George Hartwell, who had handled land fraud cases before. Eva would write to her brother-in-law, Marcus, who held her original deed, and ask him to bring it in person to Tucson, because mailing it felt like too much risk. Jim Beaumont would quietly speak to the 2 other homesteaders in the area who were likely on Cobb's list, men named Abernathy and Sutcliffe, and bring them into the effort. Thomas would keep watch on the road from the west, the direction from which Cobb's men usually came, and send word the moment any of them appeared. Cobb has men who ride for him, Graham said. 3 that I know of. One is named Wade Sutter, who is the worst of them. He is the one who delivers the papers and stands there while people pack their things. He does not use violence directly, but he implies it well enough that it amounts to the same thing. I have met Wade Sutter, Eva said, and her voice had gone quiet in the particular way that meant the memory was not pleasant. He came out here twice, once with Cobb and once alone after Cobb's visit. He told me I should think carefully about my situation. She paused. I told him I thought very clearly and that he should get off my land. He'll come back, Graham said. When the paperwork is ready, he will come back with it. Then we need to be ready before that, Eva said. How long do we have? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Fulton is processing 3 sets of papers at the moment, and yours will be the last of this batch based on what my contact in Prescott City told me. Then we have 2 weeks. We have 2 weeks, Graham agreed. He rode for Tucson the next morning, first light, and he pushed Scout harder than he liked because the timeline was tight and Hartwell was the kind of man who needed time to build a case properly. The road to Tucson was a full day's ride, and he arrived at dusk, stabled Scout at the best livery in town, and went directly to find George Hartwell. Hartwell was a small, neat man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the precise habits of someone who had spent decades winning arguments with paperwork. He listened to everything Graham had without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities, and then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Royce Fulton," he said. "Yes. I've had suspicions about Fulton for 2 years. Never had enough to move on." He looked at the copies of Eva's documents that Graham had brought. "This is good. This is very good. If the original deed survives the comparison and we can get a surveyor to certify the discrepancy, we can have the fraudulent claim voided by the territorial court." He tapped his finger on the table. "The harder problem is Cobb. Without tying him directly to Fulton, he walks away clean." "I know," Graham said. "I've been thinking about that. There is one way." He laid out the second piece of the plan, the one he had not mentioned to Eva yet because he had not been sure Hartwell would support it. It involved a risk that Graham would have to take personally, and it was not the kind of risk he made a habit of, but sometimes the only way to catch a man who never signed anything was to give him something worth signing. Hartwell studied him over the glasses. "That is a considerable gamble." "Yes," Graham said, "and you're willing to take it." Graham thought about Eva sitting on that porch with her rifle and her coffee and her organized documents and her 2 weeks of knowing and her refusal to be moved from her own land. "Yes," he said again. Hartwell was quiet. Then he nodded. "All right. I'll draft the legal filings and arrange for Judge Abernethy in Tucson to hold them ready. You go back and do what you need to do, and when you have what we need on Cobb, you send a rider and I'll be on the next stage." Graham slept 4 hours at the boarding house and rode back before dawn. He arrived at the Yates homestead in the early afternoon to find Eva in the kitchen garden behind the house, which was laid out with a care and practicality that told him she had planned it well and tended it faithfully. She had beans coming up in neat rows and squash spreading along the southern side, and something he thought might be medicinal herbs along the fence, because she had that quality about her, of someone who thought ahead and planned for the eventualities. She heard Scout's hooves and straightened up from where she had been checking the bean stakes, and there was a moment when she saw it was him, a quick, unguarded expression that crossed her face before she put her composure back in place, and Graham noticed it and felt it somewhere low and warm in his chest. "You're back," she said. "I said I would be. People say a lot of things." She pulled off her gardening gloves. "How is Hartwell? He's ready to move. But I need to talk to you about the second part of the plan." She looked at him steadily. "Come inside." He told her everything over cold water and the last of the morning's cornbread, and she listened the way she had listened to everything else he had said, without interrupting and without visible alarm, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You are going to go to Cobb yourself," she said. "You are going to tell him you are a land speculator who wants to buy properties in this area and ask him to facilitate the transaction." I will present myself as a buyer looking for land that has changed hands recently at low prices. Men like Cobb cannot resist that kind of conversation. He will try to impress me with what he can access. And if I am careful, he will say something that ties him directly to the scheme. And if he recognizes you, he does not know my face. I have never worked a case in this part of the territory. And if he checks your credentials, I will have credentials, Graham said. Hartwell is preparing them. I will be a land agent from St. Louis with references that will hold up for as long as we need them to. Eva was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read, and then she said, "This is a great deal of risk for you to take on behalf of people you did not know 3 days ago." Graham held her gaze. "It is the right thing to do. That is not an answer to what I said." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window and landing on the table between them, and the house was very still around them, and Graham found that he was not sure he had a clean, professional answer to what she had actually said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Something shifted in her face, not soft exactly, but open in a way it hadn't been before. She looked at him for another moment and then looked down at the table and picked up her water glass, and the conversation moved back to the practical because they both needed it too. Over the next 4 days, Graham set the plan in motion. He rode into Redrock Flats and spent an evening at the saloon, asking careful questions in the way of someone who is new to a place and curious. And within 2 hours, he had a picture of how Harlan Cobb operated locally. Cobb kept an office in a stone building at the northern end of the main street, a building that announced itself as the Southwestern Land and Development Company, which was, as far as Graham could determine, a vehicle for exactly 2 things: Cobb's legitimate cattle interests and his illegitimate land acquisition. He had 4 men who worked for him openly. Wade Sutter was one. The others were named Briggs Cord, and a man everyone called Dutch who handled the horses and said almost nothing. On the second day, Thomas Beaumont rode in at mid-morning with word that Wade Sutter had been seen on the road from Prescott, which meant the paperwork was moving. Graham rode out to tell Eva, and she met him at the gate with the same unfrightened expression but something tighter around the eyes. "How long?" she asked. "A week at most," he said, "possibly less. Then you need to move faster." "I know." He went to see Cobb that afternoon. Harlan Cobb was 45, heavy-built, with a well-trimmed beard and the kind of manners that came from money, and were designed to make you forget that the money's origins were not clean. He wore a good suit and kept a bottle of decent whiskey on his desk, and he talked the way a man talks who has never been told no in a way that actually stuck. He looked at the credentials Graham presented, looked at Graham, and then leaned back in his chair with an expression of interested welcome. "St. Louis," Cobb said. "That's right," Graham said, in the easier, flatter voice he had cultivated for this kind of work. "I represent a group of investors looking at development opportunities along the railroad corridor, water rights, agricultural land, ideally properties that are available at efficient prices." "Efficient prices," Cobb said, and smiled in a way that told Graham he liked the phrase. "Foreclosures, distressed sales, that kind of thing. My clients are not interested in paying full market value for raw territory." Cobb's eyes sharpened with the light of someone who is recognizing a kindred spirit, or thinks he is. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking and pushed one across the desk. "Sit down, Mr. Prescott." Graham sat and kept his expression pleasantly businesslike. "I may know of some properties," Cobb said. "Good land, Eastern Territory, some of it newly available, quiet transactions, no complications." "My clients prefer quiet transactions," Graham said. "Of course they do." Cobb took a drink. "Tell me, are you planning to stay in Redrock Flats for a few days?" "As long as necessary," Graham said. He spent 2 hours with Cobb that afternoon, and he came out with the beginning of what Hartwell needed. Cobb had not said anything explicitly incriminating in that first meeting, but he had implied enough, and more importantly, he had agreed to a second meeting 2 days hence to present specific properties for consideration. That second meeting was where Graham intended to get him to put something in writing. He rode back to Eva's that evening and found her on the porch again. But this time, she had a lamp lit on the small table beside her chair because the evening had come on while she was working, and the lamp cast a warm light across her and the porch in the yard. And Graham tied Scout and came up the steps and found that she had already set a second chair there. He had not asked her to. She had simply done it. He sat down and they talked through what had happened with Cobb, and then they talked less about strategy and more about other things. The way conversations do when the two people in them have been focused on a task together and then ease slightly. The way muscles ease after long tension. She told him about coming out to the territory with Daniel, how they had driven a wagon out from Ohio with everything they owned packed into it, and how the Arizona sky had hit her the first time she saw it, vast and violent and beautiful in a way that made Ohio feel like a memory from another life. Daniel said, "I fell in love with the sky before I fell in love with the land," she said. He was not wrong, but I learned to love the land too, this land. She looked out into the dark beyond her gate. It is mine, not because a piece of paper says so, though the piece of paper matters, because I have put 5 years of my hands and my back and my grief into it. It is part of me now. Graham listened to her and watched her face in the lamplight and thought about how some things you work toward your whole life and some things simply arrive when you are looking in another direction. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Originally, Virginia," he said, "a small place called Culpeper. My family farmed there. Did you ever want to go back?" He considered this honestly. "No. The West suited me from the first time I saw it, the scale of it." He looked out the same direction she had been looking. "I have spent 6 years moving through it and I still am not used to it. I think that is the point of it. You are not supposed to get used to it." She smiled at that, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face in a way that made him feel like the lamp had gotten brighter. They sat on the porch for another hour before Graham rode back to the room he had taken at the boarding house in town. And the whole ride back, he was thinking about the question she had asked him the morning he arrived, and the answer he had given, and how that answer was becoming truer every hour. The second meeting with Cobb happened 2 days later, and this time Cobb brought papers, lists of properties with prices and brief descriptions. And in talking through the proposed transaction, he mentioned, in terms that were careful but not careful enough, that the current ownership situations on 3 of the listed properties were in the process of being resolved through the land office. When Graham pressed him, professionally and not too hard, Cobb said, with the confidence of a man who had never been caught, that he had a reliable contact in the territorial land office who could ensure that the paperwork on certain transactions was processed efficiently. "Royce Fulton," Cobb said, and then caught himself slightly but not quickly enough. Graham did not react, just nodded in the manner of a man who appreciated efficiency in bureaucratic matters, but he had what he needed. He had Cobb naming Fulton in the context of land transactions that were, as far as the official record was concerned, supposed to be independent. He sent a rider to Tucson that evening. George Hartwell arrived on the stage 2 days later with a leather satchel full of filings and a manner that meant business. Graham met him at the stage and walked him directly to the sheriff's office, which was occupied by a man named Buford Crane, who was not corrupt, but who was cautious in the way of a man who had learned that powerful local interests tended to outlast outside investigators. Hartwell laid the filings in front of Buford Crane and explained them with the precision of a man who had done this before. And by the end of an hour, Crane had agreed to sign the supporting documentation that Hartwell needed to take to the territorial court. Eva heard about Hartwell's arrival from Thomas Beaumont, who had been watching the stage, and she rode into town herself, which was the first time Graham had seen her away from her homestead. She rode a solid bay mare with a competence that was entirely her own, and she wore her good hat, the one without the sweat stains from working, and when she walked into the sheriff's office and saw the papers laid out, she looked at them for a long moment and then looked at Graham. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he said. "But it's not finished yet." "No," she agreed, But it's close." Hartwell looked between them with the expression of an older man who has just correctly identified a situation that is none of his business, and he turned back to his papers with the discretion of his profession. The day Wade Sutter came to the Yates homestead was a Thursday, the kind of dry, clear Thursday the territory produced in abundance that time of year, and he came with Briggs beside him and a folded set of papers in his coat pocket. They rode up to the gate, and Sutter swung down from his horse with the unhurried manner of a man who expected this to be simple. Eva was waiting for him on the porch. Graham was standing on the porch to her left, and Buford Crane was standing in the yard to her right, and behind them, visible through the open door, was George Hartwell at the kitchen table with his satchel. Sutter stopped at the gate. He looked at Graham first, then Crane, then back at Eva. "Mrs. Yates," he said, and his voice had only a slight adjustment in it, the voice of a man who was recalculating. "Mr. Sutter," Eva said, "I suspect you have come with some papers for me." Sutter reached into his coat pocket, a slightly less confident gesture than he had intended, and produced the folded papers. He held them out. "Land claim certification from the Territorial Land Office. I am afraid your deed registration has been superseded by a prior claim. You will need to vacate the property within 30 days. Those papers," Sheriff Crane said from the yard, in the specific tone of a man who has been waiting to say this, "are the subject of a territorial court fraud proceeding filed 2 days ago in Tucson. They are, as of yesterday, legally invalid pending judicial review." He reached into his own coat and produced his copy of the filings. "Additionally, Mr. Sutter, I have a warrant here for the arrest of Royce Fulton on charges of land fraud, and a summons for Harlan Cobb to appear before Judge Abernethy in Tucson next Tuesday." Wade Sutter's face went through several things quickly: surprise, then calculation, then something that was almost decision. "I wouldn't," Graham said quietly, because he had seen Sutter's hand move and his own was already where it needed to be. Sutter looked at him for a long moment. Then he let his hand fall back to his side. "This isn't over," he said to no one in particular. "For you it likely is," Hartwell said from the kitchen doorway, where he had appeared silently with a cup of coffee. "I would strongly advise you to consider whether your employer's interests align with your own at this point, Mr. Sutter, given that he is the one facing the more serious charges, and given that cooperative testimony is traditionally treated more favorably by the courts." Sutter looked at Hartwell for a moment. Then he looked at Eva. Then he looked away, and there was something in that final look away that said something in him had folded. He got back on his horse and rode toward town with Briggs beside him, and Graham watched them go and then let out a long, slow breath he had not entirely known he was holding. Eva was very still on the porch beside him. "Is it over?" she asked. "The immediate threat is over," Graham said. "Cobb will fight the court proceedings. But without Fulton, he cannot file new claims, and once Judge Abernethy sees what Hartwell has assembled, the existing fraudulent claims will be voided. The Henderson property, the Morales property, Pete Garrett's land." He paused. "All of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she pressed her hand over her eyes briefly, not crying, but the gesture of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just felt at ease. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were bright, but her face was composed. "Good," she said. "That is good." Graham looked at her profile in the afternoon light and felt the full weight of what she had carried for those weeks with him and before him, and he felt something else too. Something that had been building since the morning he rode up to this gate, and found her waiting for him like she had always known he was coming. Hartwell and Crane drove the short distance to town in Crane's buckboard, leaving Graham and Eva on the porch as the afternoon settled around them. Neither of them moved immediately. The yard was quiet, the gate still open where Sutter had left it, and the territory stretched away in every direction in the beautiful, unconcerned way it had. "You could come in for supper," Eva said. She was looking at the gate and not at him, which told him she was not as composed as she appeared. "If you don't have somewhere else to be." "I don't have anywhere else to be," Graham said. She went inside and he followed her. And this time it was different from all the other times he had come into her kitchen, because the specific pressure that had been on everything was released, and what was left was just the two of them in a warm kitchen with a good fire, and the sound of Biscuit the mule complaining about something outside, and Eva making a beef stew from what she had on hand, and Graham sitting at the table with his jacket off and his hat on the peg by the door. Feeling more at home than he could account for, they talked through dinner about things that were not the case. She told him about her brother-in-law Marcus, who was a good man and had been a rock through Daniel's death and the difficult months after. He told her about growing up in Virginia with 3 brothers and a father who smelled permanently of wood smoke, and a mother who had taught all 4 boys to read and cook, because she maintained those were the 2 most important skills a person could have. Eva laughed at that, a real laugh, and the sound of it in that kitchen was one of the nicest things Graham had heard in a long time. After dinner, she poured 2 glasses of a decent bourbon she kept for what she called significant occasions, and they carried them back to the porch because the evening was fine, and they sat in the 2 chairs that had become, Graham noticed, their 2 chairs, and the stars came out over the Arizona territory in their enormous numbers, and the coyotes started their conversation somewhere out in the dark, and the air smelled of dust and sage. "What do you do now?" Eva asked, after a comfortable silence. "When this is finished, do you ride back to Denver?" Graham looked at the stars. He had been thinking about this for several days, turning it over the way you turn over something you are not sure how to say. "I have been thinking about that," he said. And he looked at her then, and she was already looking at him, and the lamplight from inside the house reached just far enough through the window to illuminate her face, and he thought about how a man can spend years moving through the world in a useful way and still feel, in the quiet, honest part of himself, like something is missing. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "that 6 years of moving from one case to the next, sleeping in boarding houses and eating at whatever place is nearest to the livery, I have been thinking that the thing I have been looking for without knowing I was looking for it might be something I have found." She was very still. "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he continued. "And I am not asking you to make any decision now because we have known each other less than 3 weeks and because you deserve time, and I understand that. But I would like permission to stay, Eva. Not to stay as a man helping you fight a legal case. Just to stay. To find out what this is." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could not read her face, and his heart was doing something inconvenient and irregular, and then she said, "I have been alone for 2 years. And I have been content alone. I did not expect to feel anything different." She paused. "And then you rode up to my gate at first light with your hat dusty and your face tired and your warning that I already knew, and asked in a very professional voice about Harlan Cobb, and something changed." She looked down at the bourbon glass in her hands. "I am not sure I can tell you what it was exactly, but it changed." "Eva," he said, "I am not a woman who is reckless," she said. "I am careful, I have had to be." "But careful is not the same as closed." She looked up. "You may stay. I would like it if you stayed." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that for a long time under the vast Arizona sky, not saying much, because some things are said more clearly in the quiet. The court proceedings took another month to complete. Graham stayed. He stayed in the boarding house in town, because that was the proper arrangement and Eva would not have had it otherwise. But he rode out to her homestead every morning and was there most evenings, and the people of Redrock Flats who noticed and observed, because people in small towns notice and observed that the range detective from Denver spent a considerable amount of time at the Yates place, and that Eva Yates looked different lately, not softer exactly, but lit from some interior source that had not been there before. Jim Beaumont noticed it with satisfaction and said nothing because he was a wise old man who had learned when to leave well enough alone. Hiram Pollard at the general store noticed it and mentioned it to his wife, who had been hoping for something like this for Eva since Daniel's passing, because she was a woman who believed in the necessity of love and did not think grief should be permanent residency. The sheriff noticed it and thought it was a fine thing. A man who would come all this way and do what needed doing and then stay was a man worth keeping. And he had the kind of opinion of Graham Prescott that tended to come to men who watched another man under pressure and saw what he was made of. Harlan Cobb's case came before Judge Abernethy in Tucson on a hot June Tuesday. Hartwell had built it beautifully, and Royce Fulton, faced with a choice between taking all the consequences alone or sharing them, chose sharing them, and his testimony combined with the documentary evidence and Graham's account of what Cobb had said in those 2 meetings in his office was sufficient for the judge to find against Cobb comprehensively. The fraudulent land claims were voided. The Henderson family, who had moved to a cousin's farm in New Mexico, were notified by letter that their land was restored to them, and came back 3 weeks later in a wagon piled high with everything they had taken, their youngest child riding on top of the furniture like a crow on a fence post. The Morales family, 2 parents and 4 children who had been living with relatives in Tucson, came home on a Wednesday, and Eva brought them bread and a pot of beans and stood in their yard with their mother, who wept with a totality and honesty that made Eva weep too, though she did so later and privately. Old Pete Garrett got his 11 years back. He was 62 and stubborn, and he drove his wagon back to his property and walked every inch of it the first day, which took him the better part of 3 hours given the size of it. And when he came back to his porch, he sat down and was quiet for a very long time in a way that was not sadness, but was something deeper than happiness. It was a man knowing exactly what he had and exactly what it had almost cost him. Graham rode with Eva to see Pete Garrett the day he came back, and the old man poured them each a cup of coffee and looked at Graham over the rim of his cup and said, "You're the man who put Cobb where he belongs." "A lot of people contributed to that," Graham said. "Eva foremost." Pete looked at Eva. "You always were your own cavalry girl," he said, which was the most demonstrably affectionate thing he had ever said to anyone within recorded memory, and Eva smiled and said, "Thank you, Pete." Harlan Cobb received a sentence of 7 years in the territorial prison and a fine that consumed most of his assets. Wade Sutter, who had cooperated with the court after Hartwell's quiet suggestion had landed, received a lesser sentence and served 18 months. Royce Fulton was removed from the land office permanently and faced proceedings in 3 counties, which was, as Graham told Eva, about as much justice as the territorial system was prepared to deliver in 1 year, and was more than most land fraud cases ever saw. "It is not perfect," Eva said, when they heard the verdict on Cobb. They were sitting outside the courthouse in Tucson in the shade of the building, while the street went about its business around them. "No," Graham said. "The Morales family lost months of their season. Pete Garrett lost almost 2 years. Those things do not go back." She was quiet. "And there are men like Cobb all across the territory doing this same thing to people who do not have land surveys in their family or brothers-in-law holding their deeds or range detectives riding up at dawn." "Yes," Graham said, "that is true. Does it trouble you, working within a system that is this imperfect?" He thought about it honestly. "It troubles me every time I see what the gap between what the system promises and what it delivers can cost people. But I believe in the difference between the outcome we got here and the outcome we would have gotten if no one had tried. Pete Garrett is on his land. The Morales children are in their home. That is not everything, but it is not nothing." She looked at him. "No," she said, "it is not nothing." He took her hand there on the courthouse steps in Tucson, and she let him, the way she had been letting him with increasing naturalness over these weeks, and they sat like that while the afternoon light moved around the building and the town of Tucson did what towns did. Marcus, Eva's brother-in-law, came to town for the proceedings. He was a quiet, observant man in his mid-30s, who looked at Graham with the thorough assessment of someone who had loved the man his sister-in-law had married, and was being careful on her behalf. They had dinner together the evening after the verdict. all three of them at the best restaurant in Tucson, which was not impressive by any Eastern standard but was warm and the food was good. And by the end of the evening, Marcus had settled into a comfortable quality toward Graham that told Graham the assessment had come out in his favor. When Marcus went to his room, Graham and Eva walked back through the Tucson streets in the evening, which were lit by gas lamps along the main boulevard and by stars everywhere else, and they walked slowly because neither of them was in a hurry to arrive anywhere. "Marcus likes you," Eva said. "I am glad. He does not like people easily." It took him 18 months to like Daniel, which Daniel found extremely funny and Marcus found mortifying. She smiled at the memory. Daniel used to say that Marcus was the best character reference in the territory because you knew if he approved of you it was genuine. Graham looked at her profile in the lamplight. "Eva, I wrote to the association last week. I told them I was resigning my position." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him. "I have been traveling for 6 years," he said. "I do not want to do it anymore. I want to stop. I want to stay in one place and build something that is mine, the way you built something that is yours." He held her gaze. "I want to stop here if you will have me. I would like to ranch or help ranch because I know cattle and I know the land. I would like to be somewhere that matters to me." He paused. "You matter to me, Eva. This has been less than 2 months and I am aware of that, and I am not asking you to decide everything tonight. But I want you to know that what I feel is not confusion and it is not convenience. I know the difference." She was looking at him with those steady brown eyes that missed nothing, and the lamplight was on her face and the Arizona night was around them, and she said, "I know you know the difference. I have watched you for 2 months. You are not a careless man and you are not dishonest." She took a breath. "And what I feel is not confusion either. It frightens me slightly if I am honest." "That seems sensible," he said. "It frightens me slightly too." She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed. The same full real laugh he had first heard in her kitchen. And he laughed too because there was nothing else to do about it. And when they had both stopped, she looked up at him with something luminous in her face and said, "Ask me properly, Graham." He took both her hands in his. They're on the main street of Tucson with the gas lamps around them, and the desert stars above, and the whole enormous territory extending in every direction around this small lighted place. And he said, "Eva Yates, I rode to your gate with a warning you already knew and you asked me if I was staying. And every day since then I have been more certain that the right answer is yes. Not just for the case, not just for the land, but for you. I would like to ask you to let this become what I believe it can become, and I would like to ask you to let me court you properly if that is what you need. And eventually, if it pleases you, I would like to ask you to marry me. But I will start with the courtship because you deserve to be asked correctly." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and she said, "Yes, to the courtship. And Graham, I suspect the eventual question will receive the same answer, but I think we should let it be eventual." He brought her hands to his lips and held them there for a moment, and she leaned forward and kissed his cheek with a softness that was entirely unlike the composed and practical woman she showed the world. And they stood there for a moment in the Tucson lamplight before they continued walking back through the town. The summer deepened into the particular gold and copper of an Arizona late season, and Graham moved his things from the boarding house in Red Rock Flats to the small bunkhouse on Eva's property that had sat empty since she had needed a hired hand the previous spring. It was proper and everyone in town accepted it as proper, and it gave Graham his place on the land that he needed, the ability to work with Eva on the daily business of the homestead, to learn her land the way she knew it, to understand the 40 acres and the small herd and what they needed, and how the water moved and where the good grass was. He learned that Eva rose before the sun every day without exception, and that her first hour was spent in a quiet he did not interrupt, because he recognized it as essential. He learned that she talked to Biscuit the mule, and that Biscuit responded in the specific loquacious way of a mule who had been talked to for years, and considered it his due. He learned that she was a better shot with the Winchester than she let on, and that she knew the land immediately around the homestead better than anyone, every rise and dip, and where the snakes sunned, and where the quail nested. She learned that he woke in the night sometimes from old work memories he did not speak about much, and that he was better in the morning once he had a cup of coffee and the immediate business of the day. She learned that he was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked, not from an excess of helpfulness, but from a simple refusal to walk past something that needed doing. She learned that he was funny in a quiet, dry way that took some time to notice, and that once you noticed it, you could not stop noticing it. She learned that he was generous with the people of the town in the same uncalculated way he was generous with everything, that he would give his afternoon to help the Morales family repair their roof, not because it was useful to know the Morales family, but because the roof needed repairing and he was free. Jim Beaumont watched all of this with the satisfaction of a man who has seen many things in his long years and recognizes the ones that matter. He had Graham and Eva to dinner at his ranch one Sunday in August, along with Thomas and a few of the other homesteaders, and after dinner when the women were talking on the porch and the men were at the other end of the yard with their pipes, Jim said to Graham in a low voice, "You planning to make it formal?" Graham looked at him. "In my own time, Jim." "Of course," Jim said, and smoked his pipe with the expression of a man who is entirely unbothered. "Just observing that fall is a fine time for a wedding in this territory. The heat breaks, the light is exceptional, not that I'm pushing." "Noted," Graham said. "And if you need someone to stand up with you, I am available," Jim added, and then walked away before Graham could respond, which was Jim's preferred conversational technique. He asked her on a September evening. They had ridden out that afternoon to check on the herd, which was healthy and settled in its autumn grazing patterns, and they had come back in the early evening, and he had unsaddled Scout while she had unsaddled her mare. And then they had stood in the corral with the horses and the good smell of hay and horse, and the long light of a September evening lying flat and gold across everything. He said her name and she looked at him, and he said it simply, without a speech this time, because the speech had been made and they had both known for months that this was where they were going. He asked her to marry him, and she said yes with the directness that was entirely her own quality, without theater and without hesitation. And then she stepped forward, and he held her, and the horses moved around them in the soft September light, and neither of them said anything for a while because words were beside the point. They married in October, in the church with the crooked steeple, and the whole of Redrock Flats came, because the whole of Redrock Flats had watched this happen and felt proprietary about it in the way of small communities that share everything. Jim Beaumont stood up with Graham. Thomas stood beside him. Eva's brother-in-law Marcus came from Tucson with his wife and their 2 small children. The Henderson family came back from their restored farm for the occasion. The Morales family came, and their oldest daughter, who was 13 and thought romance was complicated and interesting, watched the whole ceremony with intense brown eyes. Old Pete Garrett came, which was surprising because Pete did not generally appear at social gatherings, and when asked about it later he said he went because Eva Yates deserved to see that people were glad for her, and that was that. Eva wore the dress she had been keeping for the right occasion, cream-colored with small blue flowers along the collar, and she had her dark hair down in a way Graham had not seen before, loose around her shoulders, and when she walked down the aisle of that small church toward him, Graham felt something that he thought would have been too large for words even if he had been a man given to excessive words, which he was not. A preacher, a man named Holloway who had christened half the children in Redrock Flats and buried more than a few of its residents, read the words over them with the seriousness the occasion deserved, and when he asked if anyone present had reason to object to this union, there was a silence in the church that was absolute, and then someone, Graham would always suspect it was Jim Beaumont, said, "No objection here," and several people laughed, and the weight of the moment broke into something lighter and better. They said their vows, and the words they said were old and simple, and felt new anyway, the way old things feel new when they are being lived for the first time. Graham put a ring on Eva's finger that he had bought from the jeweler in Tucson, a plain gold band that she had told him was exactly what she wanted when he had asked, and she put one on his in return, which was her own idea, and which Graham wore with a quiet pride that he felt every time he looked at his own hand. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Beaumont Ranch, because Jim had the largest yard, and there was music from a fiddle player named Cass who could make a fiddle sound like it was crying or laughing at will, and food that had been contributed from every kitchen in the community, so that the table was full of things that represented the whole of Redrock Flats in its mixture. Eva's beef stew, alongside Mrs. Morales's tamales, alongside Mrs. Pollard's apple cake, alongside Jim's inexhaustible supply of good whiskey. Graham danced with Eva in the yard under strings of lanterns that Jim's ranch hands had hung from the porch to the fence and back, and the fiddle was playing something slow, and the night air had the first true coolness of autumn in it, and he held her properly, and they danced with the ease of two people who have finally arrived somewhere they had been moving toward without knowing it. "Happy?" he asked her. "Yes," she said, in a clear, certain way that left no room for qualification. "Good," he said. "Me too." She laughed softly against his shoulder. "That is the most Graham Prescott statement that has ever been made. I have more elaborate ones available," he said, "if required." "They are not required," she said, and he could feel her smiling against him. "This is enough. This is exactly enough." The winter after they married was a mild one, which the old-timers said was a good omen for the years ahead, and which Graham, who was not generally superstitious, was willing to accept as such. They spent it working the homestead through the quieter season, mending fences and repairing the barn roof and laying in stores. And on the evenings they sat at the kitchen table with books and the lamp between them, reading or talked or played cards in a desultory way that was really just an excuse for companionship. The small house, which had always had Eva's quality in it, began to have Graham's too, imperceptibly, the way a place absorbs the people who live in it. In February, Eva told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, matter-of-factly, with her coffee in hand, in the way she handled most significant things, directly and without excessive drama. Graham set his own cup down and looked at her, and then he did something that surprised them both. He covered his face with his hands for a moment the way men do, when an emotion is too large and immediate for the usual management of it, and then he lowered his hands and his eyes were bright and he said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have felt better in the mornings, but that is to be expected and it passes." He stood up and came around the table and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a moment, and then he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then he sat back down and picked up his coffee because he did not know what else to do with himself. And she laughed at him in the warm and private way she had developed for laughing at him when he was being endearingly uncertain. And then they talked about what would need to be done to prepare, because that was what they did. Marcus came down from Tucson when Eva wrote to him, and his wife came with him, a woman named Clara who had delivered 2 children of her own, and whose presence was practically reassuring and emotionally warm in equal parts. Jim Beaumont sent Thomas over to help with the heavier spring work so Graham could focus on the things closer to the house, and the community of Redrock Flats, which now considered Eva and Graham its own in the specific possessive way of places that have watched people earn their belonging, offered the various forms of practical support that small communities offer when a child is coming. The baby came in September, the same month Graham had asked Eva to marry him in the corral, which felt significant in the way coincidences do when you are happy enough to find meaning in them. It was a boy, born on a Tuesday morning after a labor that Eva handled with the focused determination she brought to everything difficult. The doctor came from Tucson, and Clara was there, and Jim Beaumont paced in the yard outside for 3 hours until Graham came out to tell him, and Jim stopped pacing and took off his hat and held it to his chest and said, "Good. That's very good." They named him Daniel James, Daniel for Eva's first husband who had been a good man and deserved to be remembered, James for Jim Beaumont who was still alive and pretended to be unbothered by the honor, but who, when told, had to look away for a moment and be quiet. Graham had suggested Daniel because he had come to understand that Daniel Yates was not a shadow but a foundation, that the life Eva had built from her grief for him was the life that had produced the woman Graham loved, and honoring him was honoring the whole of her. Eva held their son in the afternoon light that came through the bedroom window, and Graham sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them. This woman who had been waiting for him on her porch with a rifle and already knew everything, and this new small person who had Daniel Yates' jaw and Graham Prescott's green eyes already visible in their infant form. And he thought about all the roads that had led to this particular Tuesday in September in the Arizona territory. Daniel James grew the way healthy children grow, rapidly, and with increasing opinions about everything. He walked early, which Graham took as evidence of good sense and Eva took as evidence of an inheritance of stubbornness, and they were both probably right. He followed Graham around the property from the time he could walk steadily, which meant the animals were his natural companions long before he was old enough to work with them. And Biscuit the mule, who was old now but still formidable in character, regarded the small boy with the specific tolerance of a senior animal who has decided that a child is acceptable. Jim Beaumont came to see Daniel James every week for the first year and then every 2 weeks as the boy got sturdier, and he would tell the boy elaborate and only partially truthful stories about the early days of the Arizona territory, while Daniel James sat in his lap and stared up at him with Graham's green eyes, apparently understanding none of it but enjoying the sound. The spring after Daniel James's first birthday, Eva came to find Graham in the barn where he was working on a wheel for the wagon, and she stood in the doorway with the same matter-of-fact morning quality she had had when she told him about Daniel James, and he looked at her and said, "Another." "Another," she confirmed. He grinned, which was not an expression that had been much on his face before Eva, but which had become increasingly natural to it in the 2.5 years of their marriage. Daniel James will be pleased to have someone to instruct. He will be insufferable about it, Eva agreed. He is already insufferable about the chickens. This baby came in November, the second pregnancy as straightforward as the first, and this time it was a girl, small and dark-haired like Eva from the very beginning, who arrived squalling and declarative and clearly intended to make herself known. They named her Rose Clara, Clara for Marcus's wife who had been so steady and helpful during both pregnancies, and who wept with pleasure when she was told. Rose Clara was, from her earliest days, entirely different from her brother. Daniel James was deliberate and observant, studied things carefully before engaging with them, had his father's quality of moving through the world with quiet attention. Rose was immediate and expressive, reached for everything, had opinions that she communicated with conviction before she had the language for them, and fastened herself to people with an intensity that was entirely her own. She had Eva's eyes, the dark, steady ones, and something of Eva's directness too, but the volume at which she deployed it was new. Daniel James regarded his sister for the first week with the expression of a child who is recalculating something significant, and then one afternoon when she was lying on the blanket on the floor and making her sounds at the ceiling, he lay down beside her and made them back at her, and from that point, they were each other's primary interest in the way of siblings who are well matched. The years moved through Red Rock Flats with the quality of years that are full and good, not without difficulty, because no life in the Arizona territory was without the difficulties of weather and drought and the ordinary disasters of ranching, but full of the specific substance of a life that is being genuinely lived. Graham expanded the cattle operation in the third year, buying additional stock from Jim Beaumont, who was beginning to scale back, and hiring 2 hands, brothers named Elias and Sam, who were hardworking and honest, and who had been recommended by Thomas Beaumont. The 40 acres that Eva had held alone for 2 years became a working ranch that required attention and rewarded it. Eva did not recede into the house. That was never who she was. She remained the one who understood the land best, who knew every corner of the property, who kept the accounts with the same precise organization she had brought to fighting Harlan Cobb's land scheme years before. The kitchen garden expanded in the third year because Rose Clara showed an early interest in growing things. And by the time Rose was 4, she had her own small portion of it that she tended with a seriousness that made Graham and Eva exchange glances above her head. Daniel James preferred the animals, particularly the horses, and by the time he was 5, he was riding with his father in the same natural way that Graham had ridden since he could remember, the 2 of them going out in the mornings to check on the herd with the easy companionship of people who are happy in the same place. Jim Beaumont died in the spring when Daniel James was 5, quietly in his sleep in the house he had built himself 30 years earlier, and his death was a clean death for a man who had lived fully and known exactly what he valued. Graham and Eva were with Thomas and his family for the funeral, and afterward they stood in Jim's yard in the spring light, and Graham thought about the old man telling him that fall was a fine time for a wedding, and he felt something that was grief and gratitude in equal measure. Thomas Beaumont held the Beaumont Ranch on. He was 32 now, steady and capable, and he and Graham had developed the kind of working friendship that grows between men who respect each other's competence and do not need more of each other than what they genuinely have to give. Thomas married a woman named Anna the following year, and Redrock Flats made a celebration of it the way it had celebrated Eva and Graham's wedding, with food from every kitchen and fiddle music and lanterns in the yard, and the children ran through all of it in the specific unsupervised joy of children at parties. Pete Garrett lived to 74 and died on his own land, which was what he had wanted. The Henderson family had 2 more children after returning to their homestead. The Morales family's oldest daughter, the one who had watched Eva and Graham's wedding with such intensity, grew up to be a schoolteacher in Tucson and came back to visit every Christmas with the kind of life that had been possible partly because her family had been able to stay in the place where she grew up and know it and be shaped by it. Eva's brother-in-law Marcus wrote every month and visited twice a year, and Daniel James called him Uncle Marcus and considered him the best source of candy in the territory, which Marcus found both flattering and suspicious. Clara and Eva had the warm, uncomplicated friendship of women who genuinely like each other and who have been present for each other at the moments that mattered. In the evenings, when the children were in their beds and the ranch was settled into its nighttime sounds, Graham and Eva sat on the porch in the chairs that were still the same chairs, though they had been repaired twice, and talked, or were quiet in the way of people who have accumulated enough shared time that silence is not empty. The territory spread away from them in its enormous beautiful darkness, and the stars were what they had always been, vast and indifferent and magnificent, and the coyotes had their conversations in the dark the way they always had. One October evening, 6 years after their wedding, Eva leaned her head back against her chair and said, "Do you ever think about the morning you rode up to this gate?" "Sometimes," Graham said. "What do you think when you think about it?" He looked at her in the lamplight that came through the window, the dark hair that had a few threads of silver in it now that he found beautiful, the brown eyes that still missed nothing, the face that he knew as well as any face in the world. "I think that I was very good at my job for 6 years," he said, "and I think I did not know what I was riding toward." She looked at him. "You rode up with a warning I already knew." "You did. And you stayed," she smiled. "You stayed and you helped me answer it." "Yes," he said. "I am glad you stayed," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs, the same way he had reached across the first time, and took her hand, the same hand with the plain gold band on it that had been there for 6 years, and she held his hand in both of hers the way she had developed a habit of doing. "I could not have done anything else," he said. "Not after you asked me that way." "What way?" She was smiling. "Like the answer would be what it would be and you would deal with either one," he said. "Like you were completely prepared to do it alone, but you were asking anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "I had done everything alone for 2 years. I knew I could do it alone. But I wanted to know if you were the kind of man who would stay." She looked at their joined hands. "You were." "I am," he said. Rose Clara's voice came from inside the house, not in distress, just that particular call a child makes when they have woken and want to know where their parents are. Eva started to rise, but Graham said, "I'll go," and he went inside and found Rose at the top of the short staircase in her nightdress, looking down with her mother's dark eyes. "Papa," she said, in the tone of a child who has decided this was a reasonable time to be awake. "Come here," he said, and she came down the stairs and he picked her up and she settled against him with the boneless quality of a half-awake child, her dark hair against his shoulder. He carried her back upstairs and stood for a moment in the doorway of the children's room where Daniel James was still soundly asleep, and he looked at both of them, these 2 children who were half Eva and half him and entirely themselves. And then he settled Rose back into her bed and pulled the blanket up, and she was asleep again before he reached the door. He went back out to the porch and sat back down and took Eva's hand again. "Asleep?" she asked. "Before I was out the door." She smiled, and they sat together in the October night with the stars above the territory and the ranch quiet around them and the lamp burning in the window behind them, casting its warm light out into the dark. And it was, Graham thought, exactly what everything was supposed to be. Not perfect the way pictures are perfect, but whole, completed, real in the way that only the things you have genuinely worked for are real. The way Eva's land was real to her because she had put her hands into it. The way their marriage was real because they had put themselves into it. The lamp burned and the stars turned and the territory went on being enormous and beautiful and indifferent in the best possible way. And Graham Prescott held his wife's hand on the porch where she had been sitting the morning he rode up with his warning. And all the roads that had brought him here and all the roads that stretched ahead were, in this moment, the same road, the one that led exactly here, and that was more than enough. 2 years later, Eva told him there would be a 3rd child, and this time Graham did not cover his face or grin immediately or do anything except look at her for a long moment in the morning light, and she looked back at him with the same steady certainty she had always had, and he said, "I love you," she said. "I know." She picked up her coffee. "I love you too. Now come and eat, because there is a fence section down on the east side and Elias needs help and you have been sitting there for 5 minutes." He laughed and got up and went to the stove, and she moved beside him in the kitchen they knew completely, in the house that held all of them, on the land that was theirs in every way that mattered. And outside the Arizona sky was doing the thing it always did in the mornings that had first made Eva fall in love with it, going from dark to the most extraordinary colors, the land taking on form and dimension out of the night as the light built and built, revealing everything it contained. The 3rd child was born in the following spring, another boy, healthy and loud, and they named him James Graham. James for old Jim Beaumont, who had earned the naming twice now, and Graham for his father because Eva said he deserved to have something named for him too. And when she said this, Graham had no answer for it that was adequate to what he felt. So he said nothing, only held her hand the way he had been holding it for years. James Graham grew up to be the quietest of the 3 children, and also, somehow, the funniest, with his father's dry humor arriving even earlier than it had in Graham and deployed with a precision that made his older siblings look at each other in frequent consternation. Daniel James became, as he grew, the rancher his father had become, rooted in the land and patient with it. Rose Clara kept her garden and expanded her interests and read every book she could find, and had her mother's quality of already knowing things when she was told them, which was either useful or maddening depending on the situation. Eva and Graham grew older in the way of people who are growing older in the right place, with the right people, surrounded by the evidence of what they had built, and Redrock Flats grew too, slowly the way frontier towns grew when they had the right bones, adding a schoolhouse and a better doctor and more families, and the particular texture of a community that was becoming permanent. The land that Eva had refused to give up, the 40 acres that Harlan Cobb had meant to take from her, became the heart of a ranch that the Prescott family would work for generations. The deed with the correct survey figures, the one Marcus had brought to Tucson and that Hartwell had used to build their case, hung framed in the kitchen where they had first sat together over coffee and documents, and sometimes one of the children would ask about it and Graham or Eva would tell the story, the morning with the warning and the porch and the rifle and the question Eva had asked. Did you come to warn her? Yes. Did she already know? She already knew. Did you stay to help her answer it? He stayed. He had always been going to stay, though he had not known it yet when he tied Scout to the post at her gate and followed her up those steps into her kitchen. He had found out the answer to the question at the same time he found out why it mattered, and by then staying was not a decision but a fact. The way the land was a fact and the sky was a fact, and the woman who knew everything and asked anyway was the most important fact of everything. He stayed. He had not done anything else from that morning on.